The trade tensions between the United States and China has been escalating since the U.S. side decided to slash heavy tariffs on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods going into the country. The dispute has created quite some sense of uncertainty for the world economy. Take a look at this first.
With a heated discussion on trade friction with the U.S., China is welcoming guests from around the world to its 2018 Boao Forum. On Wednesday, Chinese President Xi Jinping will deliver a speech, which will likely touch upon China's next move. At the beginning of April, Trump administration announced that the U.S. would release a list of some 1,300 products that could be targeted with a 25% tariff, worth a total of $50 billion based on the results of an investigation into China's alleged theft of U.S. intellectual property. Right after that, Beijing announced that it would fight fire with fire. China published a list of U.S. imports, also worth $50 billion, on which it will levy a 25% tariff. China's hit list was smaller, but targeted to hurt sensitive U.S. sectors, such as soybean farming. In some of the major soybean farming U.S. states, Mr. Trump's action has backfired.
I want to tell the Trump administration that, we're the people that put you here in rural America, and you're trying to hurt us for a little gain in a small segment of the economy.
It's a very politically sensitive spot for the president, who relied on some of that farming vote from the Midwest in order to win the White House. Also in Pennsylvania, Michigan, these states were very critical to the president. So yes, they could be hurt in this process.
China has repeatedly warned the U.S. that any unilateral move of levying tariffs on Chinese goods will be met with countermeasures.
This is a unilateralist and protectionist action. We will certainly fight back.
On Sunday, President Trump tweeted that taxes will become reciprocal and a deal will be made on intellectual property. The tweet didn't explain why he was optimistic about resolving the U.S.-China trade friction, but President Trump said he and Chinese President Xi Jinping would always be friends, no matter what happens with our dispute on trade.
That's a brief wrap-up of the trade dispute between the United States and China. No wonder it has become the headline for discussion at this year's Boao Forum as well. On that, I invited Jean-Pierre Raffarin, former French Prime Minister, for an in-depth discussion. Prime Minister Raffarin is an extremely firm and outspoken person on this. China-U.S. trade dispute, we see some apparent escalation of it. So, Mr. Prime Minister, what do you make of the latest round?
It's a bad thing, and we think that protectionism is not a good way in such a dangerous world. We need to have agreement, we need to have dialogue, and we don't like that one country take alone decisions against another. We think that we have to answer with multilateral dialogue. That's a subject about what Mr. Macron talked with President Xi. And I think they agree we need to have multilateral dialogue to discuss this situation.
But Mr. Prime Minister, people say, well, the European countries could be quite tricky in a way, because if heavy tariffs are being levied on Chinese goods, well, the Europeans are being exempted by the Americans from the heavy tariffs, then the Europeans, when they become realistic, they could just watch whatever is going on and never say a word.
That's a bad situation. We can't have one president, Mr. Trump, who is decided alone what happens with the world trade. We need to have cooperation. We need to discuss together. That's the reason why we have answered to the United States that we want to discuss in a multilateral size and not only bilateral discussion.
You mean, Mr. Prime Minister, even though the American, for example, the Trump administration give, let's just say, French, exemption from the heavy tariffs, you will still proceed with a multilateral platform. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's our position. We are thinking that we need a world agreement.
But what about within the European Union? We know some countries are very outspoken about this, like France. Other countries could be tricky. So will France be able to stand on its own, saying this is what we believe, or it has to come with a quote-unquote consensus coming from the European Union, and then it becomes tricky?
I think that nowadays Mr. Macron has leadership enough to explain to his partners that we need to have multilateral discussion. And it could be a bad orientation to decide each by each.
People have been saying tariffs is a tool back in the 1980s. Remember, Mr. Prime Minister? But today, it has been very different when it comes to the world order and the way people interact with one another. So is tariff the way, or there should be much more inspirational ideas in order to solve what we have today?
Mr. Macron gives a good answer. We need to have a balanced cooperation. We need to have trade cooperation, and this cooperation must be balanced. We have to decide a lot of steps to have, in turn, balanced cooperation. And we can't have only short-term discussion. We need to have a long-term vision.
But the U.S. midterm election is just a few months from now.
Yes,
the presidential election only 2 years from now. So I'm not sure whether they're with you about that reason.
Yeah, yes, I think that that's the reason why Mr. Trump is on a wrong way, because we need to have a balanced world. We need to have multipolarity. We need to have a balanced trade. So it's not possible to have a balanced trade in short term. We need to take decision for the future to reach a good situation, which is a balanced trade.
You remember, Mr. Prime Minister, with your political wisdom and also your knowledge of history, at the very beginning of the 20th century, in the 1930s, we have seen once again in the 1980s, issues like that, trade protectionism popped up, which all led to certain kinds of, first of all, the First World War, the Second World War, and certainly a Cold War. So now we see the protectionism rise again. People wonder, what would all of this mean for us, short term, and even more fearful about the long term?
The reason why the world is very dangerous right now. We have a lot of tensions, we have a lot of wars everywhere, we have terrorism, and we can't have, with now the news, we can't have economic war everywhere. So we need to share what we can call the consensus of Teng. We need reforms and we need openness. I have seen how China is becoming again a great country with reforms and openness. Nowadays, every country needs to make reforms, but we need openness. It's stupid to make reforms and to close the borders. We need to be open, and that's the reason why we have a very important growth in China for the last years. It's the reason of the opening economy. And now it's very strange, but Deng Xiaoping, 40 years after his decision for China, is a good vision for everywhere.
But now the complaint is the WTO is not moving fast enough to catch up with all the changes. That we all know. But the question is how? How to make that balance? On the one hand, you rely on international platforms, which tends to be slow. because you need to consult. But on the other hand, you really have urgent issues to resolve.
It's a very difficult question, but we know that we can choose the scenario of the past. We know that with nationalism, with protectionism, and with terrorism, and so on, at the end, we have war, we have fights, so we can't take this way. So we have to work together. That's the reason why France and China have agreed to have multilateral solution. Right now, the bilateral policy is the main policy everywhere. Mr. Putin has discussion with Mr. Erdogan, Mr. Trump wants to make the war with Mr. Xi, and so on everywhere. It's not possible to have a world of peace with only bilateral interests. We need to have a multilateral discussion. We need to have win-win cooperation. That's the reason why Belt and Road Initiative, for me, is an initiative for financial question, for infrastructures, for economic problems, right. But it's a project for peace.
I know you're very passionate about Belt and Road Initiative. Many people coming to Boao are. We're going to talk about that later, but for now, I want to push a little bit further on this question. Mr. Prime Minister, the question is, what's next, right? I mean, do you think things will get ever worse, or probably much worse?
I think that things will be improved in the next future, because there is no solution for the United States to keep in this way. So I am optimistic.
And you also heard from China that in the next years, Chinese, according to the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, once a week ago in a speech, is likely to purchase 8 trillion worth of goods from all over the world in order to balance the trade and also in order to contribute, and of course to change China's economic structures too. How much opportunity do you think that would provide, in a way, about the structural changes, reform and opening up that we talked about earlier for the other countries?
Firstly, is an answer to the United States. And we can't have a discussion which is only between 2 big nations. And when this decision has been taken, Mr. Macron has called Mr. Xi, and he has called also Mr. Trump, and he said, discuss together in this situation. We need to have a discussion at a large scale. So I think that China has no solution if they don't take such a decision, because they have to answer, but it's a short-term answer. Yeah. We have to organize the discussion right now.
Belt and Road Initiative, many people see it in 2 layers. One, their interaction with China. The other thing is much more multilateral than just with China, because it's a platform everybody could talk to each other and cross-talk in a way. How do you think this will provide some immediate opportunities for countries, whether large or small, Mr. Prime Minister?
It's a bit difficult because we need to have an European answer, because we have a plan, for example, for infrastructures. It's called the Juncker Plan, and we make a lot of investment in infrastructure. So we have to coordinate what we organize with the Juncker Plan and what we can do with the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think that in the beginning of July, we will have a common answer from the European Commission about Belt and Road Initiative and the participation of Europe, with a good coordination between our own investments and the investments in the initiative of Mr. Xi.
So from now to July, not very long time, I have to say,
Yes,
Mr. Prime
yes.
Minister, when it comes to drawing up with a plan. So what is that last mile for the European Union to come up with a consensus? What is it about?
We have already organized a work. For example, in my country, I am in charge of discussion with industrial people, with regions, with a lot of actors to find some big projects in infrastructures to propose to the Chinese to invest together. So I think we will be ready at the beginning of the summer to propose some initiative to our partner in Belt and Road Initiative.
Do you think there will still be enough momentum among those countries, France included, to participate and push forward with even more efficiency about the plan?
If we can choose good projects.
Yes.
We don't need to have a global discussion.
What is a good project for you?
I think good project is project which is already engaged between France and China and with companies who are working together already. And they can develop this project on the road. So, for example, we have 5 or 6 projects, and I think that the French Minister of Foreign Affairs will be in China in a few weeks, and he will propose some projects. I think we need to have concrete discussion, not theoretical discussion. What we want to do.
Yes.
Are you agree with my project or not? If you agree, actions.
You are a fan of always studying governance, lifelong learning about governance. You even read the book of Chinese President Xi Jinping talking about governance. You even you even took some notes about that too, and compare notes with the Chinese President Xi Jinping when you saw him last time. I wonder what was his response to you?
These books are very important. Why? Because Mr. Xi writes what he wants to do. That's the reason why I have said many times China is predictable. The 19th Congress is not a surprise. We have seen what the President wants to do, and we have seen what he has written, and we have seen a lot of signal of his action. So I think that the distance of humanity, Belt and Road Initiative, that's not new ideas. The fight against corruption, that's not a new idea.
Right.
That's a very clear strategy. In few years, Mr. Xi is becoming a world leader. He is a leader, and he has a very strong leadership.
Mr. Prime Minister, you've been a leader, and you have always been one who's cultivating the governance styles. I want to ask you, what kind of leadership do we want in our world today? Because we see the style of leadership in the current White House. We also see the style of leadership in different parts of the world, of course in China as well. What kind of leadership do you think, Mr. Prime Minister, at the dramatic change time that we need?
We need to have leaders with projects, and not only for their country, but for every country. I think that now we need to have cooperation against war. We need to have international cooperation. That's the reason why protectionism is the wrong way. We need to have international cooperation against war. And for having international cooperation, we have to propose projects. You know, Belt and Road is a big project. Of course for China, of course for Asia, but also for other countries. And that's a very big 1,000 billion of dollars. It's something like 10 more than Marshall Plan in the past. So it's very important. And it's a project for corporations against war.
Right.
And the leaders nowadays is a man who is able to propose to the other projects which are good for his country, of course. Everybody has to work for his country and for his people, but also for the other.
That is Jean-Pierre Raffarin, former French Prime Minister, talking to me earlier here in Boao Forum. Coming up, our discussion on innovation and openness.